Welcome everyone to Hydroterra's webinar. Today we've got Andrew Green, who's going to be presenting on a topic, optimising the long-term benefits from closed landfill sites. We've got a great audience today, so thanks very much for everyone joining. Before we get started, I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we conduct our work across this great land, and for that privilege we would like to thank the traditional owners. Hydroterra respectfully acknowledges the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, where we are located today, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So there's a picture of our presenter, Andrew Green, who's Technical Executive at Geoenvironmental Engineering with WSP. I've known Andrew for many years. We worked together at Golder Associates, and he's a true expert in the space of landfills. I'm the person on the left, and I will be facilitating the webinar today. Before we get started, a few things. So we love your questions, and feel free to raise those questions during the webinar by using the Q&A button. Type your questions in there, and at the end I will read out those questions. We've also got some early bird questions, which we'll go through first, of which there's about 8 today. Thanks very much for sending those in. Why does Hydroterra undertake these webinars? Well, we like to share knowledge, and Andrew's certainly got a lot of knowledge in landfill, and looking forward to hearing what he has to say. We also like to facilitate education. I think there's a need for extending these sort of more applied education in the current environment in Australia, and we like to take an industry leadership position. A bit about today's presenter. So Andrew Green is a technical executive at WSP's Melbourne office. He's got over 30 years experience providing solid waste management consulting services for landfill investigation, permitting, design and assessment projects throughout Australia and Southeast Asia. Andrew is a certified practicing civil engineer and a member of the Waste Management and Resource Recovery Association of Australia. Now, one thing that makes Andrew pretty unique is that he actually spent 28 years working continuously at Golder Associates, and now Golder Associates has been, incorporated into WSP, so another 2 years there. So a fantastic effort of continual work in that organisation. Having worked with Andrew, I can vouch for his knowledge. He's a true expert, and that expertise has been gleaned from many, many projects, real applied expertise that we're going to get a bit of today. So just a bit about the webinar itself. So really, Andrew's talking about what we should be doing with closed landfills in the changing world. Traditionally, they've been capped, rehabilitated and converted to parks and open space and a passive recreation once they've been filled. However, the world's changed, right? And this graph here just shows the change in the value of land over, approximately 20 years on that right-hand side there. So there's been a change in the commercial drivers. This land is now worth a lot more. So we need to be looking at it through a different paradigm. Also, we're running a bit short of land, right? Particularly in those inner areas. The second big change has been the new regulations, and that change in regulatory framework means realistically more obligations, and there's going to be more ongoing costs for these closed landfills. So the question becomes, who pays, right? So if it remains public open land, then it's going to be public purse that's paying for that. So we really need to think about, A, can we afford it? Afford all that regulation? And if we can't, well, we need to start thinking more innovatively about how we can generate more value from these closed landfills to pay for that. So it's important, more important than ever, to consider the alternatives to traditional closure projects, to look at how they can generate an income to pay for the site's ongoing management is one of the key points today. And this webinar explores the engineering challenges associated with development on and adjacent to municipal landfills and the potential benefits for end users. Finally, I'd like to just point out there are lots of sites available. In Victoria, for example, there's a landfill register that you can get through that link there. That's not all of the landfills, right? There are additional landfills for that, but it's a pretty comprehensive list. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Andrew, who's going to run us through his presentation. Over to you, Andrew.
Great, thanks, Richard. And thanks for the opportunity to present to everyone. I understand we'll have some questions at the end, so please do put them into the Q&A session. If we don't get through all the questions today, then Richard and I will follow up through Richard's network. So hopefully you can see the opening slide there. It's a shot of the opening credits, but it's basically a presentation that I've prepared around optimising the long-term benefit of closed landfills. And really, if you get nothing else out of my presentation today, I hope you'll get the sense that we've been underutilising these old closed landfill sites. And the beauty of these sites is they're often very large areas. In the metropolitan setting, they're also in right within the inner city residential zones often, and/or they're on the periphery of the metro area. And looking to the future, we can see that they'll quickly be encroached by all the urban development. So that's sort of at the heart of this. Is I think we need now to have a change in the way that we think about these sites, rather than just capping them off and turning them into parks. We'll be presenting to you about a whole range of other options we have. And again, just reiterating, following up from what Richard said a bit earlier, WSP acknowledges that every project we work on takes place on First Peoples lands. So we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first scientists and engineers, and pay our respects to elders past and present. So just a brief overview of the presentation. Apologies for some of the participants who are coming in from interstate. This is very much written around the Victorian setting, but a lot of the themes are really go nationally right across Australia. So when I'm talking about the history, it's of the Victorian landfill scene. I'll talk a little bit about regulatory background, options for closed landfills, after-use examples, some engineering challenges, and being what we call at WSP future ready, which is trying to think ahead. So not just thinking about it when the landfill is closed, but actually preparing for the closed state as you're filling and as you're operating these landfills. Thanks, Richard. So, a history of Victorian landfills. I started work in 1993. So at that point, we were only 3 years after the first drought-breaking Collingwood flag. The regulations in the Victorian landfill market were actually fairly limited, let's say. So pre-1990s, there was no consistent regulation. There was no liners on the base of the landfills. You were filling a hole. In rural landfills, we were burning waste in trenches. And the reason I know that is because I came off a farm in the Western District, and it used to be a great fun to go to the local tip and forage around for things and stick them back in the trailer. And then every month or so, they would actually literally light up a trench. So we sort of shake our heads about that now, but that was the practice in the pre-1990s. By the mid-1990s, some of the learnings that came through from North America and Europe started to filter into the Australian scene. We had our early regulators. We're starting to see sideliner only in some of the larger metropolitan sites, and typically no floor liner. So I can remember in 1996 even doing jobs where we were building sideliner and thinking, okay, that's fine, we'll stop it and continue to pump groundwater so there'll be an inward gradient. So great theory, but it's sort of forgot all about diffusion. And we've moved on since that time. Typically, the landfill caps are about 1 metre thick. They comprise clay and cover soil. And importantly, that next dot point, the third-party gas to energy. So some of the large players came in and basically offered to collect the landfill gas and convert that to royalties. So a lot of local councils thought, what a great deal. You know, we don't need to pay for any infrastructure. The large energy company comes in, installs a lot, and that worked very well, I would say, for some period of time. But all of those contracts were set up around commercial drivers, let's say, getting royalties from collecting some of the gas. And now we're in this setting in the modern future part now where we actually need to start thinking about environmental controls, which will start to come through in my presentation. So in 2001, the Victorian EPA brought in more regulations that started to influence the way that we site, design and operate landfills. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail shortly. But really at 2001, only the really large metropolitan municipal landfills were using geosynthetic liners. So when we think about after use of sites, we're still up till 2001, we don't actually have any floor liners on these sites. And that's important from a footings point of view, which I'll get to in a minute. So regulatory background. So pre-2001, we had the old Environment Protection Act 1970. We had these things called SEPs, which were state environmental protection policies. We had one for landfills. It was about a 10-page document. And if I were to summarise it, it would say, don't leave standing water around and keep the seagulls away. It was probably a little bit better than that, but you get the general idea. It was pretty rudimentary, high-level guidelines. And it had high-level aims with minimal documentation. By 2001, EPA then brought in the BEPM as we now know it. But the early guideline was only a guideline. It wasn't mandatory at that point. And so a lot of the landfills still continued on the way they had, or they were closing out existing landfill cells. And so really it was only some of the major operators who started to take on board some of these guidelines. That all changed in 2004 when the Victorian government gazetted the waste management policy. And the waste management policy effectively gave teeth to the BEPM and said, you know, for 2 out of 3 parts for every key criteria, they became mandatory. And the third part was either you do it or some equivalent to that outcome. And so it still took another 1 to 2 years to implement these new guidelines. They brought in geosynthetic liners on the sides and floor, and they brought in geosynthetics into landfill closures, into the landfill cap itself. So the important date there is 2006, right? So we're getting a lot closer to the current timeframe. 2009, 2012 period, we had a very famous incident here in Melbourne. I won't go into the detail of it, but essentially landfill gas moving laterally out from an old capped site. After that happened, the Auditor General report led to EPA reforms to regulations. And the biggest change was in 2010 when they then upgraded the BEPM document to introduce environmental auditors and the whole audit process and a number of ancillary documents that came with it. By that point, there's extensive use of geosynthetics in the floor and the cap. Landfill gas management starts to pivot from commercial drivers to from commercial drivers to environmental drivers. So now, instead of collecting landfill gas for royalties, we're now collecting it to manage our risk of lateral migration outwards and upwards from the landfill. And it sort of coincided with our sort of a general change, I think, in the general community with their understanding of potential for greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then the closed landfill guidelines came in 2012 and they were updated again in 2018. So now we go forward, so 21, 23, in the Victorian setting, we've got a new act now, the Environment Protection Act 2017. It only really became activated on the 1st of July 2021. And 2 of the key things that come from that are the general environmental duty, and the state of knowledge. So the GED, I think the Queenslanders are probably to blame for the GED. They had that sort of terminology in their guidance documents. EPA Victoria brought that on board, and it requires any person who's engaging in an activity that may pose a risk of harm to human health or the environment from pollution or waste to minimise those risks so far as reasonably practicable. So they're really key words at the back end. And so essentially what it really gets down to is we've got this current state of knowledge, and the GED requires you to sort of forward think about sites and think about environmental harm and take reasonably practical measures to prevent that. So there's a real sea change in the way these landfills are being sited, designed and operated. The next slide is a slide of a modern landfill cell. You just get the sense of it now. So they're usually quite deep holes. They're usually at least 10 metres deep below ground level, and they'll often have a mounted section that's anywhere from 10 to 20 metres above ground level on top. And so you can see from the slide there, there's synthetic liners going in on the floor now and up the side walls. The white is just a protection layer over the top of some synthetic liners. So if you think about now, when we're trying to put some sort of development over landfill, from 2006 onwards, we need to start thinking about how we interact the footings with these geosynthetic liners that we're seeing in the more modern sites. Thanks, Richard. So why the history lesson? Well, you can learn a lot from history because invariably we make the same issues that have come along, and I see this over my 30-year life. I see the same things coming up consistently. So it's really useful to look back and help that history lesson to inform decisions on after use. So really, the landfill age is an important first thing to consider. There's options for end use depending on the floor and the cap liner. I'll talk a little bit about urban encroachment, and basically where we're headed with this is the regulations are leading to a large increase in the cost for the long-term management of closed landfills. So that's why it's important now. We need to maximise their benefit. We need to do everything we can on that large site to try and help pay for this ongoing maintenance and monitoring that will be needed for several decades. The other drivers really is the increase in land prices, and Richard showed us a really nice slide before where if you think about where those regulations started, so if we start with 2001, land prices have increased 5-fold since the first BEPM came in. So that's a period of about 20 years. Even from when the 2010 BEPM came in, that was a lot more prescriptive and put a lot more onus on operators. Land prices have doubled since 2010. According to Richard's slides, and in some states even more. So it just gives you a bit of an idea now that commercial drivers are now in place that make these sites more attractive to develop. The Victorian government's also pushing for increased density in metropolitan areas along key streets. They've actually got several plans related to that. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that the regulators still have concerns around landfill gas risk. And so as designers and operators and ultimately developers and landowners, it's important that we understand those risks and manage them because they're engineerable. You know, there's a lot of great knowledge out there built up over a long period of time that will help us deal with these issues. And as ever, for proponents, they need to consider the time to evaluate and mitigate these landfill gas risks. Thanks, Richard. So urban encroachment, here's a site out in the west of Melbourne. The blue circle is the landfill. This is now about 13 years ago. Go to the next slide. The green circles, you can start to see the urban encroachment in and around the buffers for this landfill. So the important thing to note here is, if you just go back one, Richard, sorry, is don't for a minute think that I'm trying to argue for development during the operation of the landfill. It's actually really important to maintain these buffers. They're an important aspect of the ongoing operation of the landfill while it's operating. My thesis is really around as we get to the closed state. Thanks, Richard. So key messages: you can develop over and adjacent to landfills. It is possible in their closed state. We need to be future ready in the design of our landfill cells and caps and preparing for after use. And the key pieces that we need to consider is landfill gas and water management, and that rings through all of these landfills, so that we can optimise the long-term benefit to offset the cost of ongoing monitoring and maintenance. Thanks, Richard. So what are our after-use options? So the most common used option in Melbourne is parks and open space. That's been the tradition. We've got these sites that are anywhere from 10 to 60 hectares in area, including in rural areas as well. I shouldn't be too metro-centric here. That's often what they're converted to. And the photo on the right-hand side there is All Nations Park in Northcote, which I believe is actually one of the best closure jobs in Melbourne. And I'll explain why later. There are energy parks. So this is a tremendous footprint of area where we've got options for solar. Wind, probably not in metropolitan areas, because wind requires a nice even flow leading up to the site. But I think for regional sites, wind is still definitely an option. And then obviously landfill gas on the larger sites, not so much on the medium size and smaller. I'm going to be talking about combined heat and power. I'll wait for those slides, and then battery storage. So there's a lot of talk in the news about regulating our energy market and dealing with the fact that there's so much solar power now being generated at residential homes level. We now need to start evening out the balance of that energy through the day. So there's a need for some form of energy storage. And I say to you that these closed sites are a terrific spot for battery storage, because you're right next to the end users and the end generators as well. Now you can use it for a viewing platform, a golf course, a sports oval, and then I'll talk a little bit more about commercial development, in particular medium density residential. And even the Grand Prix track in Albert Park is actually an old landfill. So options for closed landfill. This is with thanks to Energy Victoria. This is a classic battery storage area. You're talking about an area that might be anywhere from 1 to 5 hectares in size. It can be larger. All of the buildings and modules you can see in that photo are all what I would call basically a single story development. So they're the sorts of things where we don't have to have our footings right down on the natural ground. We can actually float these on top of the landfill cap, as long as we're preparing for it and constructing the cap accordingly. We can put this sort of material straight on top and float on top as sort of like a stiffened raft version of it. There's a range of geosynthetics you can use to achieve that. Thanks, Richard. And then, of course, no doubt about the best use for closed landfills is sporting ovals, and go the mighty Pies.
Oh,
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so now I'll go to our after-use example of case one. This is the All Nations Park in Northcote, inner city Melbourne, northern suburbs, for those who aren't familiar with Melbourne. You can see on the green line is the extent of what was the old Northcote pottery. So originally this is brickworks for the local area. They made all the bricks that went into buildings all around Melbourne. You'll see in a minute, but the right-hand side of that was a very deep hole, and the left-hand side was the actual brickworks. And so they would take the clay out, and they had an enormous hole in the ground that was then turned into a municipal landfill. And this is what it looks like now, 25 years on from that original closure. So it's a great example of how you can work constructively. You can get a really good outcome from an old landfill. You can interface with the local community. You can get some really great benefits. So medium density residential, underneath that white blob, there's actually about a 10 to 15 story residential development, which I'll show you some photos of. There's a shopping centre, there's a skate park, a basketball court, a viewing mound and a park, and a nice little pond. Thanks,
So,
Richard.
Andrew, just in that, so where's the actual boundary of the
Well, that's a great question, Richard, and if you keep watching, I'll show you where that boundary is. Okay, so there's some of the park features. You note the slide on the left is using asphalt as their walkways, and for maintenance vehicles. The use of asphalt's a good one for these closed landfill. You need something that's quite flexible as the waste settles. You want it to move with it and not be too rigid. In the middle, you can see the Anzac Memorial there. And so there's basically just a thickened up section of landfill cap and it's floating on top. Another great site feature. And then on the right-hand side is a basketball court. And I've been watching closely how that court behaves and it's going really well. I think they might have had some soil reinforcement underneath it. But you could expect with time that there'll be some cracking of that slab, and that's just part of normal maintenance. But you can engineer for that. Thanks, Richard. And then on the left-hand side photo, you can see the medium density residential, and that's part of what is pushing the drivers here. I'm not really proposing individual house residential because I just don't think the controls are in place. But with something like a medium density residential, you can get that in front of the body corporate and have that consistency of maintenance and monitoring of buildings. And on the right-hand side, you can see the asphalt car park that sits around the site. So that does move around a little bit, and that's just part and parcel. You need to top that up. Thanks, Richard. Going back to your question now, Richard. So the orange line is the barrier layer that's built between the municipal landfill on your right and the what was the old brickworks factory on the left. And so that basically when they made their bricks, they then they occasionally they had to get bricks that were no good. So they just used to push them out to the side from the brickworks. And so to the left of the orange line is actually old kiln bricks that are either misshapen or not used. Then there's a clay liner barrier in between, and both sides do have their own gas collection systems as well. And then the municipal on the left, on the right, sorry. So yeah, just a really good example, 25 years of that in play right now. This is another site up at Cooper Street in Epping. So as a young engineer, one of my old bosses sent me off to this site many years ago to be the landfill manager for a couple of months because they were in between managers. So I remember this from the late 90s. And again, I'm not involved with this personally, but I know WSP has dealings with it. But if you go to the next slide, the blue circle is where the landfill was, and the green now is commercial development. Again, you know, medium density residential and extensions to an existing hospital. So another great use for an old closed landfill site. So there's a lot of engineering challenges involved. I'm sort of keeping this typically high level, but we need to start planning for the future. We need to engineer our controls for landfill gas. And importantly, we need to consider what other key site infrastructure like water management needs to be dealt with when we're trying to put something else on our landfill cap. Thanks, Richard. So just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of the scale of things. So on the right-hand side, the top photo, this is a small scale blower unit. It's associated with a medium density building. It's just part of an ancillary backup. So essentially it's creating air exchange below the building. And we're not talking about something that takes 2 rooms to fit it in. Like this is quite a small pump that we're talking about that would fit in a phone box. You know, it's down at that sort of level. And all it's doing is just pushing a little bit of air in through the gaps underneath this building to keep the airflow going. And that's one of the measures that is dealt with. So just to get you an idea, it doesn't have to be excessively costly to do this sort of work. And then obviously then when you go to the larger scale projects, then there's more elements of gas geomembranes, which would typically is our first line of defence. Active gas extraction in the actual landfill itself. And then these smaller scale blower units that are throwing air through. And then one of the other important parts of all of this is the ongoing monitoring. So, you know, if you want to get into that side of things, you can get hold of our man Richard Campbell at Hydroterra, who installed the telemetry and the monitoring system for us on that project.
Thanks for the plug, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay, and then case number 3 is the Cairns closed landfill. So again, this is sort of more like your traditional landfill cap like we're used to. Just think about trying to put these sort of structures in a rainfall where rain is measured in metres. I mean, Cairns is only sort of 50 or 100 k away from the Golden Gumboot area of far north Queensland, where they've got massive rainfall, measured in 2 to 3 metres. And so the important thing from this slide is just the importance of water management. And you can see the new transfer station building on the sort of right-hand side of that photo, and some other buildings that are either on or adjacent to that landfill. So now if you go to the next one. Thanks, Richard. And so the point of this slide really is just to talk to you about water management and interaction with future use. So again, the same site, this is Cairns. And so you can see the intensity of some of these rain events and the size of the rock channels that we're using to take water off the top of this landfill. So if you're thinking, all right, well, what if I put solar on this? Or what if I put a battery storage? What if I put a medium density residential right next to it? So you don't want that medium residential density building to be flooded by all the water that you're going to need to deal with. So there's that interaction between the engineering and the after use. Thanks, Richard.
Does that have a continuous groundwater system as well?
Yeah, a lot of these sites will be balancing surface water leachate, which is leachate is just water within the waste, and groundwater issues. And so in most cases we're monitoring all 3 in the operational phase, and then also in the closed state.
So that's got an ongoing automated pumping system.
It depends on the site, Richard. So it might be there might be leachate treatment, it might be going to sewer. The surface water aspects of it is usually going out into the local water catchment. So it's slowing it down, dropping out the sediment, and then sending it on its way. All right, so now just to talk about Future Ready. So this is a major part of what we do as part of everything that we do within WSP. And as you can see there from our global pres, in very simplistic view of this, Future Ready is really about, it's at the center of what we should be aspiring to do as a business and the way we serve our clients in the years to come. So it's preparation. It's thinking about those things. Okay, well, we're getting climate change now. We're getting more intense wind events, we're getting more intense rainfall. How will that affect my future development? And I'll show you a couple of slides about things that you can be thinking about. How do I reduce my greenhouse gas emissions from just building the physical works that we're proposing for it? Thanks, Richard. So Future Ready. We need to be pre-planning for development on the landfill during the operation of the site. The municipal waste will settle with time. So, your typical municipal waste will settle between 10 and 15% of its depth. So if you're talking about 20 metres of landfill waste over the journey of several decades, you could expect that to settle, 1 to 2 metres. So we need to be thinking about that in our designs. Footings are the key. For anything over a 1-storey building, you need to be thinking about your footings. So typically we're driving piles into the placed waste if there's no floor liner, and you're driving it down through the waste and embedding the piles down on the natural soils underlying it. Now that we've got these more modern landfills with geosynthetic liners, obviously we can't do that exercise. We can't punch holes in the floor liner or allow leachate to escape out into the surrounds. And so I think we need to be now thinking about designing baseliners for the future footings that come during the operation of the landfill. And we might be looking at things like stone columns that are basically, in its simplistic form, it's a column of stones that comes up and provides a platform at the top end. One of the hardest things when we're talking about this is that the typical density of footings is in a range around sort of 5 to 10 metres apart. So it's obviously not practical just to run footings at that sort of spacing all the way up as you're trying to place waste. Like, I wouldn't like to be going to one of the operators and saying, hey, you need to get this large landfill compactor and you need to dodge columns every 5 to 10 metres. So these are the things that challenge us and make us think about, okay, where are we putting things ahead of time so that we don't have to over-engineer? And then the second part to it is the heating and cooling of future buildings, using ponds for cooling and concrete footings to assist with that, which is really big in some of the colder countries of the world, like the North Americas and Europe. And I'll show you some slides in a minute.
So just on your principle here of pre-planning, so right at the beginning, you're designing your first cell. The owner of the landfill at that stage is probably a couple of steps removed from any developer who's going to commercialise the site, aren't they? Normally.
So that's a great question, Richard. And I don't pretend to have all the answers here, but what I will tell you is, so the history of the way landfills evolved is that the early landfills were actually sand miners and they were quarry people. And so they were digging holes in the ground. And when they'd finished digging holes in the ground, they looked around and went, well, what else can we do here? And then they started getting into landfills. And so these were the early adopters. Then as the industry matured, then some of the larger, more national and global private companies started to take over and improve standards and drive what we now call as the modern landfills. But there's no reason at all in my mind why the landowners right now, the landfill operators, can't be setting in place either their own agreements or partnering up with someone. But the key message is do it early. Don't leave it till right at the end. Because if you leave it till the end, it's going to cost more to retrospectively try and outfit this.
Second question I had around this was, where it's a modern landfill with a liner, and you've said, well, we can't obviously punch, piles down through that. If they haven't put in any of these sort of future footing structures, effectively that's ruling out the option for sort of building on top of that to a fair degree. Is that right?
It's not completely ruling it out, Richard, but it's making it very difficult because we have to get a firm seal down at the base liner level. So if you start trying to punch holes in that floor liner, that's a very difficult thing to do retrospectively. Yeah. What you need is actually a good civil engineer to work that out for you, Richard.
I'm looking around.
Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so now future ready. So some of the things that we need to be thinking about, ground source heat pumps. So if we're putting a multi on place, there's a really large cost on electricity at the moment. These are now getting closer to commercial reality. So in its simplest form, it's using a closed loop system. It's a pipe. You're distributing a liquid through it, and you're either drawing heat out of the ground, and then you're boosting it when it gets back up to the surface. Or so that's the winter scenario on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side during the heart of summer, again you're using the relative stability of the temperature of the ground to cool the liquids and cool your house. So you're just basically recirculating a liquid. And if you go to the next slide, Richard, perhaps just go one more slide for me, mate, and we'll go back to that one. One more. Yeah. So this is a shot from Shadow Green, but you can see on the right-hand side is our equivalent to what I'm talking about here, but it's a gas-fired heat pump. And on the left-hand side is the recirculated liquids. So that's just basically a hydronic system at residential level. And what we're talking about doing is saving energy by using closed loop and regulating that temperature. And you might not get it right to the final end of this heat that you need, but you're saving a lot of energy and then boosting it, and probably with solar or something that's perhaps a little bit more modern than the old gas. Thanks, Richard. If you can now go back 3 slides, please, mate. Okay, now go forward. And so now what we're really saying is, as we plan for these development either on or adjacent to the landfill, we need to be thinking about our footings. So there's still opportunities to put these right next to the landfill in the area that was otherwise a buffer zone. And these footings are basically piled down into the natural soils. So you're drilling a diameter hole around 900 millimetres to 1.2 mil. You're putting a reinforcing cage in, and I'll show you a shot in a minute. But it's basically that closed loop is then heating all of that building, using the heat from the landfill waste. So again, landfill waste has a sort of typical, during active stage, the temperature of that waste in its normal form will be somewhere between 30 and 60 degrees. And when you think about our normal temperature at offices around Melbourne is probably around 19 to 20 degrees, perhaps a little bit higher. So we can be using the heat from the landfill in these closed loop systems to heat our buildings and save a lot of money. You can also use the cool from natural soils, and you can use ponds as well. So that's what we're on about. Richard, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. So here's 3 examples of how you actually practically do it. The photo on the left-hand side is coils of the loops laying out at ground level, and then the left-hand photo just gets covered again with soil. So that's only 1 or 2 meters below ground level. That's all you need to get away from the general atmosphere and to have your system in place. The photo in the centre is the bored pier after installation, so you can just see they've drilled their hole, they've put the loop in, and then they've backfilled with concrete, and you can see the pipework sticking out the top. And then the photo on the right is a cage from a bored pier. So that's what it looks like. That's the steel reinforcing that you'd be putting down a bored pier as a footing. And then you can see there's some some HDPE pipe strapped to the inside of that reinforcing cage. So you have that all made up beforehand. You drill your hole down, you run the reinforcing in, you pour that concrete as your footing, and there's your closed loop system. Thanks, Richard. And we've seen that slide. And then the last item that I wanted to raise was around sustainable reuse of waste material. So we've had a couple of projects now where we used what we called Visi Sand. So Visi Recycling do a great job of recycling a lot of our materials from residential pickup. Out the other end of that process, after you've sorted out all your plastics and your bottles and glass, the portion that's glass will go to these special facilities where they're basically running lasers at the colour of the glass, right? So they're picking whether it's your beer bottle from the celebrations of the Collingwood Mighty Magpies Grand Final win, or you might be at the races, different coloured wine bottles at Richard's house. All these different glass colours are in there, and they're running lasers at it and picturing that colour of the glass. And when they see the right colour, they throw that bit of glass off to the left and the right. Unfortunately, when we're doing all this, you get little shards of glass that come out the other end, and they end up being about a sand-sized particle. So we, over a series of projects in the 10s and the 20s, reused a lot of that waste material as a substitute for sand. So you can see the bottom picture on the right-hand side is actually basically a sand substitute. It's this fine-grained material that's a terrific replacement material, and it's a reuse of a waste material. So we're using that in the landfill cap as the drainage layer above the synthetic liners. And then as much as you can, try and reuse materials from either close proximity or from on-site. Thanks, Richard. Now, you've probably worked out by now, I've got a little bit of skin in the game. I've been in it for 30 years. I've got plenty of grey hairs from working on landfill sites all over Australia and Southeast Asia. But I've put in this slide as artificial intelligence because when I first sort of started thinking about AI, my first reaction, like a lot of people probably of my age, was like, "Oh, you've got to be joking me! Like, talk about a recipe for disaster." But I actually think we need to be more proactive along this. We need to be thinking about AI and using it appropriately. And there'll be something that'll come up in the next 5 to 10 years that we won't have even dreamt of yet, that'll be applying into all of our engineering that we apply to projects on a daily basis. So I think we just need to keep an open mind and think about how AI can help us. Thanks, Richard.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. That was fantastic. A few lessons when I went through the slides that I thought we should reiterate. These closed landfills, they're either going to be a cost to us as a community, or they're going to be a great opportunity. And I think Andrew's painting a pretty good picture of what can be done with them with smart engineering. And we can make it easier if we think ahead rather than spending lots and lots of money at the end. A bit of future thinking is a very good idea. Obviously, there'll be some challenges with that. You know, almost the master planning phase, we need to start thinking well beyond just where we're going to put our landfill cells, but also where we're going to develop, which will be an interesting exercise. Optimising the opportunity requires long-term vision, smart engineering, and smart monitoring. You know, obviously Hydroterra is a specialist in the monitoring side of things, but I think Andrew has shown us some examples of really smart engineering. There's a real resource there in the waste, isn't there, in terms of being a source of heat, for example, just as one example. So I think we need to think more creatively. And the current situation of high land prices and the increasing regulatory burden really does providing a compelling case for us to stop and rethink what we're doing with these sites. But I thought, Andrew, your presentation was really good at setting the scene for that. Now we've got some early bird questions, and then we've got a couple of additional questions in the Q&A. If you've got any other questions, feel free to add them in now. But we will charge into these. Got about 10 minutes left. Question number 1, should closed landfills be developed? It seems to be the only way to guarantee open green space in urban spaces.
That's a great question, Richard. Maybe if I take on from here. So terrific question, because if you think about some of the landfills in the Clayton area of southeast Melbourne, they have this thing they call a chain of parks. And it's basically a series of green parks that connect each other right through that Clayton region, which is a great example actually of forward planning. So I wouldn't advocate to completely black out these sites. And I think the All Nations Park case number 1 that I presented to you is a really good example of how you can have both. You know, you can have some development, some commercial aspects to it, and still maintain quite a large green park. I mean, that's my local park. I can tell you that it's where I had my kids, and we kicked many footballs and walked many dogs on that site. So yeah, thanks for that. I think it's a balance of the two. And I guess my key message is we need to optimise the use of it. Doesn't mean we have to completely cover them. What do you see the future of phytocapping? Do you see them being used as nature parks? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the phytocap side of things originated actually out of mine closure work in semi-arid conditions, which I wouldn't really describe much of Victoria as, but that's not to say that you can't use phytocapping. We know that it's been used all around Australia on various projects. I guess I was using geosynthetics in this example because it's one of the more common elements in a landfill cap. But, you know, I've got some local council clients who have just finished a really great version of a phytocap out in the east of Victoria in conditions that are well suited to phytocapping. And absolutely they can be used as nature parks. No problem at all. We've just got to engineer for that. How do optimisations fit into the new sustainability and environmental social governance commitments for landscaping? Yeah, I think 3 is a very similar theme to 1, Richard, in terms of sustainability. So there's sustainability of materials when you're building. I showed you in that last slide. But there's also that the societal part of having free space to walk around in. And, you know, that's part and parcel of having parks as part of that closure plan, not just as the only one. What is the most significant risk associated with landfill redevelopment for more sensitive purposes such as residential? Well, what a great question, because to my mind, I don't feel like we should be putting individual residential housing on closed landfills. I just feel like by the time that house gets sold 3, 4, 6 times in the next 20 years, that knowledge about how to maintain and monitor the ground that you're building that residential, that small single story on, goes away with that first person as they leave and sell their site. So I'm not advocating for single residential. I'm advocating for medium density or better, where you've got a body corporate that can keep the knowledge.
Aren't the conditions of the site, like say an environmental management plan, effectively linked to the title?
You can, Richard, but I guess I've seen many environmental management plans over the years. They look great sitting on the shelf, and as to whether they actually get used or not is up for grabs. But the most significant risk, sorry, just to finish on 4, is management of landfill gas, in my opinion, and management of leachate on the footings. Encroachment, do you see significant residential pressures to develop these sites in regional areas? Yeah, regional areas perhaps not as much. That landfills tend to be a little bit out from the town, but you know, that'll change over time as well, just like it has in metropolitan Melbourne. Most of the landfill sites that we're involved with are actually a decent distance out of town, but then you get some of the really old ones that are right on the edge of town. So yeah, encroachment's a continuing thing that needs to be managed. 6, are there any particular landfill or rehab design approaches that better facilitate higher end use? Yeah, well, I hope with the answer to 6 has kind of come out of my presentation today. There's no one particular design or approach that is the be all and end all. And I think it really depends on where you are, how your connections are to the local electricity grid. You know, is it going to cost you $500,000 just to try and put in enough power lines to take your energy park from the site to the local network, in which case perhaps the commercial driver isn't there. It's really a case-by-case approach there.
One suitability thing to think about there, Greenie, is, you know, if the end use is predominantly, you know, rehabilitating to a beautiful parkland, then the surrounding land value goes through the roof, right? You know, like an extreme example would be the Botanic Gardens used to be a landfill, right, in Melbourne. So I think there's that aspect to it as well, right?
Yeah, there is. There's no doubt, Richard. But if I think back to All Nations, so the northern frontage of All Nations used to be everyone's backyard, and then the park was built, and then suddenly they subdivided all their land and built a whole bunch of townhouses that looked out over the park. But I guess those same people then walk across the park into the local shopping centre, and then their kids are now, because they can't afford houses, they're buying units in the medium density residential for their kids, because to help them get a start in life. You know, so there's 2 sides to every coin on that, I think. Number 7, suitability of solar farms and batteries on former landfill sites. Absolutely. Solar farms, you just got to think about the footings and make sure that you're doing spread footings and floating on top of the landfill cap, maybe thickening up your cover soils as well, and then thinking ahead to soil erosion of the landfill cap when you've got all your solar panels in place. Again, batteries, I gave you that example of how I think that is a good use. And again, the transport of that power out from the battery storage back to the network needs to be thought through. So if you're going buried pipelines, they obviously need to be protected from landfill gas. If you're going overhead lines, then that increases the cost, but it takes away all the risk. And number 8, what safeguards are there for legacy issues long after the consultants and developers have left, residents, councils, and the public purse? Yeah, great question, number 8. So regulators have been wrestling with this for years. And I think it goes back to financial assurance work that's done, which is basically putting some money away from the developers. But as to the safeguards for legacy issues, I mean, that really gets down to the new Act and the general environmental duty and all of the ongoing monitoring and maintenance that's required. And so I say to you that the best way to manage that is actually to continue with a presence on site, to actually earn some money from that site to help fund it and to help manage it and monitor for it. And I think the safeguards are certainly enhanced now when I look back compared to when I first started in 93.
All right, we better go to the Q&A section. Got some building up there. It's nearly past. Are you happy to keep going for another 15 minutes or so?
Yeah, I am, Richard, and thanks to everyone for coming in. If you need to head off to another meeting, I'll understand. But yeah, if you can stay on, that'd be great.
Just before we move off this, you mentioned that leachate and its interaction with the footings is a major management issue. In what respect?
Sorry, I delved into the engineering for a little bit there, Richard. I sort of promised to keep it high level for you, but if you're driving piles in and you've got an unlined landfill and you're driving those piles down through the waste and into the natural to get a solid foundation, the very base of those piles is actually probably going to be sitting in liquids. A lot of the really old landfills, the systems aren't as robust, let's call it, as current development. But either way, you're still engineering your footings to make sure it can handle the more aggressive environment there, which is basically really like a corrosion of concrete issue, Richard. Yeah. They're engineerable, but you just need to plan ahead for them.
All right, thanks for that. Q&A time. So Steve Lowe's got the first question. G'day, Steve. What is the industry and government's appetite and the state of technologies that could be implemented to speed up putrescible waste landfill degradation?
Yeah, what a great question, Steve. I wish I could get you live for this one. So for many years, and still in the Victorian setting, and I think nationally as well, the regulators have what we call a dry tomb outlook on things. So they're asking us to essentially entomb the waste, keep the moisture out, and all that does, as you've obviously alluded to, Steve, is that means it just takes a lot longer to degrade down to its sort of to a lesser state. And so they have bioreactor landfills, which is basically introducing moisture to speed up the degradation process. And that sort of work, I mean, Gene Bogner's doing a lot of research on that in North America. If you're interested in that, I'd search on Gene Bogner to see what's happening there. But right now, there's no appetite for that in our Australian environment, which is a shame because that's what we should be doing. I agree.
Next question from Suanna Harvey. Where the floor liner is 1 metre of clay, no geosynthetics, would that be less of a concern regarding use of piles?
Yeah, perhaps I won't get into really specifics, Suanna, but that's obviously something that you'd need to look carefully at. It'd depend on floor grades. It'd be depending on your ability to extract all of the leachate from the base of that landfill. Yeah, it's really a case by case on something like that. I guess the case that I was giving, Richard, is where if we've got a geomembrane liner involved, either a GCL or a geomembrane, driving piles through it will damage it and tear at it as well. And if you're doing another version of it where you're screwing into the waste, with a continuous flight auger or some version of a bored pier, the action of the screwing action will grab the geomembrane and tear it. So they're the sort of things you'd need to be considering, Suenna, if you're just trying to do that same issue through a clay liner, is how do you create that seal, and how do you monitor for it as well?
All right, the next question. We need a cost-benefit study of post-closure costs versus the type of after-use to make decisions easier. Apply the after-use issues with the regulatory authorities as they will be the hurdle. What do you think of that statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Richard and I toyed with the idea of putting some commercial data in here, but it's a fool's game trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all scenario. Perhaps that's another topic for another day, Richard, if we went into this in a little bit more detail. I guess I don't have time in the current one to go into the commercials side of it. But the one thing I would say to you in all of these things is you really do need to do it on your site. Don't rely on generalistic sort of presentations because they're not intended for that use. You really need to start looking closely at your site and invest some time and funds in a good civil engineer to start looking at these options.
So if I was a landfill operator now and I was about to build a new cell, is that the time?
Absolutely, Richard. Yep, should be planning right now.
All right. Next question from Graham Ross. Hi, Graham. There is no apparent consensus as to the final treatment remediation of the Latrobe Valley coal mines. Is there an opportunity for a mine to be used as a landfill? They are up to 200 metres deep rather than filling them with precious water. Well, I suppose there are some precedents for that. Mattingley brown coal is an example of that out near Bacchus Marsh. But over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties with that particular site that was it Graham? Sorry, I missed who. Yeah, that Graham's noted is just the difficulty of developing landfills over segment A groundwater, and that's part and parcel of if you were trying to put a new landfill onto those sites. It's more difficult when you're in that sort of setting. Not to say that you can't, but my sense is it's probably there's less appetite from the regulator. It'd be interesting to probably asking the wrong person that question, Graham. Is we should really be getting EPA in here to ask that question.
They may be here. Feel free to chime in, EPA. Right. Next question. The chain of parks concept failed as no one was prepared to pay for maintenance. Government then sterilised opportunities by classifying most as green wedge.
Yeah, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that statement. So the chain of parks does exist at the moment in the Clayton area, and some of those closures are only still just happening now. I think I take the general point that the original plan for how it would all develop has probably been modified a little over the years, but there is a chain of green parks that is in that. I'm just thinking about the Clayton area as an example. But yeah, I mean, if we're getting into a discussion about long-term planning, I think that's probably getting a little off topic.
Might be a little outside of civil engineer's role. All right. Jovan Kanabadi, I hope I got that right. Should solid inert waste landfills be redeveloped differently to processable waste landfills, or is the overlap significant enough for a generalised redevelopment strategy?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same issues come up regardless of whether it's municipal or solid inert. And if I think back to some of the solid inert waste landfills from the 90s, they actually still had an element of green waste allowed into them. A small percentage, admittedly, but it was still enough to generate significant landfill gas. I think the modern landfills are certainly a lot closer to solid inert, but you can still get degradable woods and other content in solid inert in the modern landfill that still generates landfill gas. And so I think really the same issues apply in terms of water management, surface water management in particular, but also landfill gas management. I don't really see them as that dissimilar.
It's an interesting one coming up. Michelle Van Gerevink, with batteries, is there an increased risk, fire risk, on former landfill sites?
So I think you're probably assuming, there's been some examples in the media around batteries catching fire. So in a properly designed landfill cap, no, I don't see that as any normal risk, because you can put a decent soil layer in between the synthetic liners and the waste. From the waste, you can have quite a lot of physical separation to the point where you actually got all your above ground works. So I don't really see that as an issue.
What about an in waste fire?
Yeah, so now we're getting way off topic. Yeah.
You see lithium batteries as posing more of a risk?
Oh, there's no doubt.
Yeah. Something to think about. All right, off topic. Next question from Daniel Dole. How long after closure would waste still be suitable for extraction of ground heat?
For Infinity, Daniel, because I guess what I was really making the point is when they're active and you've still got that heat in there, that's just adding more beneficial. But all of the work that I showed you in those slides is actually just ground source heat pumps put into a natural soil setting. And so, your below ground temperatures are probably, I don't know, they're probably around 15 degrees, something like that, maybe 10 to 15, depending on where you are. And so anything that's warmer than that is a bonus. So it's not that you'd necessarily have to have the waste. You can be putting that in the soil right next to the landfill and still get all the same benefits.
All right. Well, Andrew, that was fantastic. We have run out of questions and we're a little bit over time. I'd just really like to thank you for what was an excellent presentation. And many thanks to everyone who attended today.
Great. Thanks a lot, Richard. Thanks for the time.
Thank you. Bye for now.